Around 560 BC, on the island of Sicily, a craftsman unveils his greatest invention to the local tyrant. It's a bull cast in bronze, hollow on the inside, and within the hour, it is going to kill its own inventor. Every punishment in this video was completely legal, designed by intelligent people, written into law, carried out in public, and every single one became so infamous that the same civilizations that invented them eventually banned them, which raises an uncomfortable question we'll answer by the end. What does it actually take for an empire to look at its own cruelty and flinch? 7 punishments, 7 bans. Let's start with the bull. Punishment number 1, the Brazen Bull from the Greek world. First, understand what this thing actually was. Picture a life-size bull sculpted entirely out of bronze, polished until it gleamed. In its side was a small door, just big enough for a man to climb through. The inside was hollow and completely empty. The condemned was locked inside, and a fire was lit underneath the bull's belly. Bronze conducts heat beautifully. So the metal floor under the victim slowly turned into a cooking surface, and the whole statue became an oven. It wasn't quick. That was the point. And there was one more feature, the one that made it famous. A system of pipes and stops ran from the chamber up into the bull's head. As the victim screamed, the pipes twisted the sound so that what came out of the bull's nostrils was not a human voice. It was a bellow. To everyone watching, the statue simply sounded like a living, snorting bull. Human suffering went in. Background farm noise came out. Now, who designs something like that? His name was Perillos, a bronze worker from Athens. His client was Phalaris, tyrant of the Greek city of Acragas in Sicily, a man with a reputation for cruelty. Perillos built the bull as a gift, a pitch for the tyrant's favor. He presented his masterpiece, explained the acoustics, and waited for his reward. Phalaris looked at the machine. Then he looked at the kind of man who could invent it. And he asked for a demonstration of the sound system from the inside. Perillos climbed in, the door shut behind him, and the fire was lit. The bull's first victim was its own inventor. And as the story goes, karma wasn't finished. When Phalaris was eventually overthrown, his own citizens allegedly roasted him in the very same bull. Historians debate how much of this really happened, but the poet Pindar was already telling the story within a century as a warning about what tyranny does. Even the Greeks looked at their own invention and filed it under never again. Still, for all its horror, the bull killed you in minutes. Our next punishment was designed to take weeks. Punishment number 2, Scaphism, the punishment of the boats from ancient Persia. Here's how the Greeks described it. The victim was laid on his back inside a narrow rowing boat. A second boat, the same size, was fastened upside down on top of him like a lid. His head, his hands, and his feet stuck out through cut openings. Everything else was sealed inside. Then came the strangest part. The executioners force-fed him milk and honey, far more than any stomach could handle. This wasn't kindness. The mixture was chosen deliberately because in those quantities, it causes catastrophic diarrhea. Trapped between the boats, the victim was soon lying in his own filth. Then they poured more honey over his face, his hands, his feet, every exposed part. And they set the boats afloat on a stagnant pond under the open sun. You can guess what the honey was for. The insects arrived within hours. Flies, wasps, and worse settled on the exposed skin and crept through the openings into the dark, warm space between the boats. And here's the detail that shows real design. The feeding didn't stop. Every day, the victim was fed again to make sure he didn't starve too quickly. The goal was to keep him alive while he was slowly consumed from the outside and the inside at once. The most famous victim was a young Persian soldier named Mithridates. His crime, believe it or not, was talking too much at a party. At the Battle of Cunaxa in 401 BC, the king's rebel brother Cyrus was killed. King Artaxerxes told the entire empire that he had struck the fatal blow personally, but at a royal banquet, Mithridates had a lot of wine and announced to the whole table that actually he was the one who killed Cyrus. Contradicting a king's war story at his own dinner party turned out to be a life decision. Mithridates was sentenced to the boats. Plutarch says he lasted 17 days. But before you add Scaphism to your nightmares, here's the twist. Every single source we have for it is Greek, and the Greeks were Persia's sworn enemies. The original account comes from Ctesias, a court gossip so unreliable that other ancient historians complained about him. No Persian record mentions the boats. No archaeology backs it up. So the cruelest punishment on this list might be 2,400-year-old propaganda, which means if you want cruelty with actual receipts, you need perpetrators who wrote it down themselves. Proudly in stone. Punishment number 3, flaying, as practiced by the Assyrian Empire. Flaying means removing a person's skin. In the Assyrian version, it was often done while the victim was still alive, with a knife, slowly and methodically, and the skin wasn't discarded afterwards. It was the whole point. The skins were stretched and displayed in public, draped over city walls or wrapped around pillars, where they would stay for years. Because for Assyria, this wasn't rage, it was advertising. The Assyrians ran the largest empire the world had yet seen, and their method for holding it together was simple: make rebellion unthinkable. Around 880 BC, the city of Tela made the mistake of revolting against King Ashurnasirpal II. We don't need enemy gossip for what happened next, because the king had it carved into his own palace walls. Quote, I flayed all the chiefs who had revolted, and I covered the pillar with their skins. That's not an accusation from his enemies. That's his official press release. And as strategy, it was coldly rational. Terror was cheaper than garrisons. Skin one city's nobles and display the results, and the next 10 cities pay their taxes early. For 2 centuries, it worked. But terror has a shelf life because it means every neighbor you have is a future enemy with excellent motivation. In 612 BC, the Babylonians, the Medes, and basically everyone else with a grudge piled onto Assyria at once. Nineveh, the capital, was burned so thoroughly that it vanished under the sand for 2,500 years. Nobody ever passed a law against flaying. The ban was more direct. The empire that skinned its enemies got skinned off the map. Now, the Assyrians were terrifying because they had no rules. The Romans are scarier for the opposite reason. The Romans had lawyers. Punishment number 4, Poena Cullei, the punishment of the sack, from ancient Rome. In Rome, the worst crime imaginable wasn't treason or murder. It was parricide, the killing of your own father. To the Romans, the father was the foundation of the family, and the family was the foundation of the state. Kill your father, and you hadn't just committed murder, you had attacked the natural order itself. So the law responded with something no angry mob would ever invent because it's far too organized. First, by some accounts, the condemned was whipped and his head was wrapped in the skin of a wolf because he no longer deserved a human face. Wooden clogs were strapped to his feet so his steps couldn't pollute the Roman earth. Then he was sewn into a large leather sack, and he did not go in alone. By the era of Emperor Hadrian, the law specified his company precisely: a dog, a rooster, a snake, and a monkey. Live ones. The sack was sewn shut and thrown into the sea or a river. Somewhere in Roman history, a room full of serious men in togas agreed that the sack needed a monkey and wrote it down. The logic was theological. A father killer was too polluted to touch the earth, the water, or the air. So Rome denied him all 3 at once and let the animals do the rest. Here's the part nobody expects, though. This punishment refused to die. The Emperor Justinian wrote it back into law in the 500 SAD, and Byzantine courts kept it for 400 years. Then medieval German states picked it up and made it their own. The last man sewn into the sack died in Saxony in 1734. That's after Isaac Newton. It wasn't formally abolished there until 1761. A punishment from ancient Rome outlived Rome itself by 1300 years. But at least the sack was honest about being an execution. Rome's other famous punishment was engineered so that legally nobody killed you at all. Punishment number 5, the burial of the Vestal Virgins, also from Rome. The Vestal Virgins were 6 priestesses whose only job was to keep Rome's sacred flame burning. Rome believed that as long as the flame burned, the city was safe. In exchange, the Vestals got rock star status, front row seats at the games, state secrets, the power to pardon prisoners just by crossing their path. The price was a 30-year vow of chastity. Break it, Romans believed, and the gods would punish the entire city with plague, with defeat, with disaster. So a fallen Vestal had to die, but here's where Rome trapped itself. Her body was sacred. Spilling her blood was sacrilege. Killing her at all was an offense against the gods, the same gods demanding her death. So Rome found a loophole, and it's the darkest loophole in legal history. Don't kill her. Just leave her somewhere. The condemned Vestal was strapped to a covered litter, bound and gagged so no one could hear her, and carried through the forum in a slow procession. It looked exactly like a funeral, except the body was still alive. At the edge of the city, near the Colline Gate, a small underground chamber waited. Inside it, a couch, a burning lamp, and small portions of bread, water, milk, and oil. She climbed down a ladder. The ladder came up. The chamber was sealed, and the earth was leveled over it so that no trace remained. See the trick? She has food. She has water. She has light. Nobody laid a hand on her. If she dies down there, that's between her and the gods. Rome, legally speaking, is innocent. In 90 AD, the Emperor Domitian condemned the chief Vestal, Cornelia, on charges that even Roman writers thought were invented. Pliny records that as she was lowered into the chamber, her robe snagged, and the executioner offered his hand. She pulled away in disgust and went down alone. That detail survived 2,000 years for a reason. The practice only ended in the late 300 SAD when Rome changed religions and the whole order was disbanded. Not banned out of mercy, banned by a new god. And that's the pattern so far, if you're keeping score. These punishments ended because a tyrant fell, an empire burned, or a religion died. Not once, because somebody felt bad. For that, you have to go to China. And to a teenage girl, punishment number 6, the 5 punishments of ancient China. This wasn't one punishment. It was the entire spine of the legal system, a menu of 5 penalties that courts applied for centuries. 1, tattooing, where the crime was inked permanently onto the criminal's face so everyone he ever met would know. 2, cutting off the nose. 3, cutting off one or both feet. 4, castration. 5, death. Notice the design. Aside from death, every punishment on the menu was mutilation, and every mutilation was permanent and visible. The point wasn't just pain. It was to mark a person for life as a criminal, someone who could never rejoin normal society, never hide, never start over. Not mob violence, a filing system. In 167 BC, a respected physician named Chunyu Yi was convicted of a crime and sentenced to mutilation. He had 5 daughters and no sons. And as he was taken away, he lamented loudly that daughters were useless in a crisis. His youngest daughter, Taiying, heard that. Her response was to follow the prison cart on foot all the way to the capital. And then she did something almost unthinkable for a common girl. She petitioned the emperor himself. Her argument wasn't just, spare my father. It was better than that. A man who is mutilated, she wrote, can never undo it, never labor, never reform. So the punishment destroys the very possibility of becoming good again. what is a legal system for, if not that? And she offered herself as a government slave in her father's place. Emperor Wen read the letter from a teenage girl, and then something genuinely rare in the ancient world happened. He agreed with it. That same year, 167 BC, he issued an edict abolishing the mutilating punishments and pardoned her father. Now, the reform wobbled. Castration crept back for decades, which is how China's greatest historian, Sima Qian, still suffered it. The mutilations weren't fully gone from the code until the Sui and Tang dynasties centuries later, but mark this moment. This is the first ban on our list that happened because one person was moved by an argument. Before you get too hopeful about humanity, though, the same civilization kept the worst punishment of all on its books for another 2,000 years. Punishment number 7, Lingchi, death by 1,000 cuts. Lingchi was reserved for the crimes China considered beyond forgiveness, treason, or killing your parent or master. Here's what it actually involved. The condemned was tied to a post in a public square in front of a crowd. Then the executioner went to work with a knife, removing flesh cut by cut, piece by piece, in a slow and prescribed sequence. Death could take hours, and the cruelty was designed to reach beyond death itself. In Chinese belief, your body was a gift from your parents, and you owed it to them to leave this world whole. Lingchi made sure you didn't. It killed you slowly, and then it condemned you in the afterlife too. It stayed legal through dynasty after dynasty, reform after reform, for roughly 1,000 years. Emperors came and went. Lingchi stayed. But by the 20th century, the world had changed in one very specific way. Cameras existed. On the 9th of April, 1905, in Beijing, a servant named Fu Zhuli was executed by Lingchi for murdering his master, a Mongol prince. In the crowd stood French soldiers, and one of them raised a camera. The photographs got out. They spread across newspapers in Europe, and the reaction was international horror. Inside China, legal reformers led by Shen Jiabin had been arguing for years that these punishments were poisoning the empire's standing in the world. Now, they had proof nobody could look away from. On the 24th of April, 1905, 15 days after those photographs were taken, the Reformers' Memorial was approved and Lingchi was abolished immediately. After 1,000 years on the books, it was gone in 2 weeks. Not because it suddenly became cruel. It had always been cruel. It was banned when it became visible. So what does it take for a civilization to look at its own cruelty and flinch? Going down our list, a tyrant needs to get cooked in his own invention. An empire needs to burn. A religion needs to die. One girl needs to write a letter, and one camera needs to be in the crowd. Every punishment in this video was legal, debated, written down, and administered by professionals who finished their shift and went home for dinner. And every one of them was eventually banned by people who couldn't believe it had ever been allowed, which means somewhere a few centuries from now, someone is probably making this exact video about us. The only question is which of our punishments makes their list. If you want to guess in the comments, I'll see you there. And if you want more history that governments would rather forget, that video on your screen is next.